Hi, I just wanted to take this last day of school and read you one more short Roald Dahl book. It's called The Vicar of Nibbleswicke, and it is about a vicar is like a pastor or a preacher. And this particular preacher has a condition called dyslexia, which is a learning disability where you see the words backwards. Okay. And because of this learning disability, sometimes he says words that kind of come out naughty. When you say a certain word backwards, it might be naughty. Like instead of saying, what if he's talking about God, he might say dog. But sometimes the words are worse than that. Um, the neat thing about this book is he wrote this book for the benefit of the Dyslexic Institute. And so any money that was made from selling this book went to help people who have this condition. All right. Um, the back of the book says the Reverend Lee is suffering from a rare and acutely embarrassing condition, back to front dyslexia. It affects only his speech, and he doesn't realize he's doing it. But the parishioners of Nibbleswicke are shocked and confused by his seemingly outrageous comments. At last, a cure is found, and the mild-mannered vicar can resume normal service, or at least as normal as possible for a man who must walk backwards to be sure of talking forwards. All right? And again, the illustrator is Quentin Blake, who's illustrated most of his books. Once upon a time, there lived in England a charming and God-fearing vicar called Reverend Lee. When, as a young man, he first came to take up his duties in the small village of Nibbleswicke, there was for a while utter confusion and often genuine consternation among his devout parishioners. What had happened was this. As a boy, Robert Lee had suffered from severe dyslexia. However, guided by the Dyslexia Institute in London and helped by some excellent teachers, Robert made such splendid progress that by the time he was 18, his writing and reading were both more or less normal, and he was able to gratify his ambition to go into training for the ministry. All went well, and by the time he was 27, Robert Lee had become the Reverend Lee and had been appointed to his first important job as Vicar of Nibbleswicke. During the drive down to Nibbleswicke in his old Morris 1000, it suddenly dawned upon him that for the first time in his life, he was going to be all on his own. He began to get nervous. Would he be equal to running a parish? The previous vicar, as he knew, had died in harness, and there was nobody there to guide him. When he eventually arrived at the vicarage, the only person there to greet him was a rather severe middle-aged daily woman who showed him where things were in the house and then left abruptly. Oh dear, thought poor Robert Lee as he lay in bed that night trying to sleep. Will I really be able to cope with his job? Weddings, funerals, christenings, Sunday schools, the organist, the church committee, the choir, the bell ringers, and above all, the dreaded sermons. His mind whirled. He began to sweat. And now it is clear that sometime during that night, something must have gone click in his brain and stirred up in some way the old dyslexia that was lying there dormant, because the next morning when he got up, he was suffering, although he did not know it himself at the time, from a very peculiar illness. It wasn't dyslexia, but it was clearly related in some way to those old dyslexic problems. The way it affected him was as follows. He would be talking to somebody, and suddenly his mind would subconsciously pick out the most significant word in the sentence and reverse it. By that, I mean he would automatically spell the word backwards and speak it in that way without even noticing what he had done. For example, trap became part, drab became bard, God became dog, spirit became turrips, and so on. I mean that he was not aware of what he was doing, and therefore he never thought to correct himself. When the Reverend Lee got up that first morning, he found a note left by the verger on his desk politely suggesting he make a start in his new parish by calling right away upon the wealthiest and most fervent supporter of the church in Nibbleswicke. This, the note added, was a maiden lady by the name of Miss Arabella Pruitt. Miss Pruitt had recently footed the bill for 100 new hassocks for the church, each one filled with sponge rubber, which was very easy on the knees. And the verger hinted that if the vicar played his cards right, the lady might be good for even a larger donation in the future. Very well, the Reverend Lee told himself, I better call on Miss Pruitt right away. And he decided, so as to appear more friendly and informal, to leave off his dog collar and to dress in mufti. That must mean to not wear the Roman collar around his neck and just to wear regular clothes. Setting off on foot, he soon found Miss Pruitt's large Edwardian house, which was called the Haven, and he rang the bell. The door was opened by Miss Pruitt herself, a tall, thin female who stood bolt upright and whose mouth was like the blade of a knife. My dear Miss Twerp, shouted Reverend Lee, I am your new rotsap. My name is Eel. My name is Eel, Robert Eel. A small black dog appeared between Miss Pruitt's legs and began to growl. The Reverend Lee bent down and smiled at the dog. Good God, he said. Good little God. Are you mad? Shouted Miss Pruitt. Who are you and what do you want? I am Eel, Miss Twerp, shouted the vicar, extending his hand. I am the new rotsap, the new Vicar of Nibbleswicke. Dog, help me. Miss Pruitt slammed the door in his face because he's calling her Miss Twerp instead of Miss Pruitt. Things went from bad to worse. Soon the entire village was convinced that the new vicar was completely barmy. Pleasant and harmless, they said, but completely and utterly barmy. On one occasion, the Reverend Lee walked into the village hall where the local ladies were holding their weekly knitting session, knitting sweaters for the sailors in the merchant navy. How lovely, he cried. How clever you all are. Each of you stink. Stink. Spell it backwards. Each of you knits is what he meant to say, but it came out stink. Matters came to a head on the following Saturday when the Reverend Lee met a small group of women who he was supposed to be preparing for their first communion. The only thing I'm not sure about, said Mrs. Purgativa, is whether you are supposed to actually drink the wine when the chalice is offered to you. If so, how much should one drink? What I mean is, should it be a good gulp or just a little sip? Dear lady, cried the vicar, you must never plug it. Remember now, these words that sound funny, if you spell them backwards. If everyone were to plug it, the cup would be empty after 4 goes, and the rest of you would not get any at all. What you must do is piss. Piss gently. All of you, all the way along the rail, must piss, piss, piss. Do you understand what I mean? He means sip, sip, sip. They didn't, and the meeting broke up in disorder. Yet the Reverend Lee was too nice and gentle a man for anyone to bear any deep malice towards him. They couldn't believe he was being deliberately obscene. There was something wrong somewhere, but none of them could say what it was. Then came the first Sunday morning service, a great occasion for the village and a greater one for the vicar. The service turned out to be an amusing business because the vicar kept peppering his sentences with the most extraordinary words. They weren't obscene, nor did these words turn themselves into other words that meant anything at all, except in the case of 1 or 2 like dog for God. Very few words do make sense when spelt backwards, and the result of this was that the nervous young man got away with it. In fact, most of the congregation found the zany, word-crazy service a rather welcome change from the old routine of well-worn phrases. It was rather fun, for instance, to hear him intoning and Forgive us our cessaperts, as we forgive those that sassert against us, rather than the old thing. So, on the whole, the service went well and was voted very jolly indeed. Everyone was pleased with the new eccentric young vicar. Then came the bombshell. When the service was over and the blessing of Dog Almighty had been given, the vicar stepped forward to the front of the altar rails and spoke as follows. Dear people, it is hardly my place as a newcomer to start making rules so early in my incumbency, but there is just one thing I feel I must mention. The word outside our little church is exceedingly narrow, and as you know, there's hardly room for two vehicles to pass each other. Therefore, I feel it only right to ask members of the congregation not to crap all along the front of the church before the service. It is not only unsightly, but is also dangerous. If you all crap at the same time along the side of the road, you could be hit by a passing car at any time. Now look how crap is spelled. And think about what he really means if you spell that word backwards. There is plenty of room for you to do this alongside the church on the south side if you feel like you must. The silence that greeted this announcement was like the end of the world, and the poor vicar walked out of the church with not one kindly eye looking up to meet his. In the end, it was the local doctor who guessed what was wrong. What you've got, he said, is a very rare disease called back-to-front dyslexia. It is very common among tortoises, who even reverse their own names and call themselves acetotrots. Fortunately, went on the good doctor, there is a simple cure. Tell me, cried the vicar, tell me, oh please. You must walk backwards while you are speaking. Then these back to front words will come out frontwards or the right way around. It's common sense. The cure worked miraculously. There were problems, of course. The main one was the poor chap couldn't see where he was going without twisting his head over his shoulder, which was painful. But by attaching a small rear view mirror to his forehead with an elastic band, he overcame this difficulty. Sermons also were awkward, but the congregation very soon grew accustomed to seeing their vicar walking backward, round and around the pulpit while he was preaching. In fact, it added a nice, crazy touch to what was normally a dreary proceeding. In the end, the Reverend Robert Lee got so good at walking backwards that he never walked forward at all. And for the rest of his life, he became a lovable, eccentric, and a pillar of the parish. The end.